I've been a detective for over 20 years. 2 decades of chasing shadows, exposing lies, and staring into the eyes of people who would rather bury the truth than face it. But no matter how many cases I solve, how many perpetrators I expose, the pain never goes away. The pain always takes on a new form, a new weight. That night, as I walked through the sterile hallways of St. Mary's Hospital, I knew my grief had found another home. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing everything in a sickly pale light. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp and metallic, almost as if the building itself were bleeding. At the end of the corridor, a young man sat hunched in a steel chair. His hands were clasped together, trembling. His head was bowed, his eyes swollen and bloodshot. It was Jack. In the emergency room, his wife, Tu Tien, lay. She had been hit by a motorbike a few hours earlier. The impact had nearly killed her, and their unborn child had died as well. Many would call it an accident. Wrong timing. Wrong place, wrong time. But I have lived long enough to know, accidents do not always come alone. Sometimes behind the wheel, there is a hand guided by hatred. Sometimes fate wears a human mask. As I stood there, watching Jack's mother try to comfort her grieving son, I felt a weight pressing down on me. A whisper told me that this was more than just misfortune. This was intentional. The official report was sketchy, almost insulting. 2 unidentified men on a motorbike hit Tu Tien as she was crossing the street. They immediately fled the scene. The victims suffered multiple injuries, and the unborn child did not survive. Cold. Clinical. As if the loss of a life could be summed up in 2 sentences. But even between those lines, something smelled rotten. 2 men, a direct attack, and a disappearance without a trace. My instincts itched. Why 2 men? Why not just one reckless driver? Why disappear without hesitation, without even feigning panic or checking on the victim? It wasn't fear. It was strategy. Later, when visiting hours were over, I returned to the ward. Jack was sleeping on the chair beside the bed, his head slumped forward, his fingers still clasped in Tu Tien's limp hand. She looked frail, her pale face pressed against the pillow, her eyes half open but distant. She slowly turned around when she sensed my presence. "I don't know you," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "But I know what happened to you was more than an accident." Her lip trembled. A tear rolled down her cheek, soaking the fabric beneath. She didn't admit it. She didn't deny it. Her silence told me more than words. The next morning, I went to the scene of the accident. It was a narrow street lined with small shops that had been closed since that evening. Locals pointed to the corner. "It happened there," they said. Their voices trailed off, as if the tragedy carried some kind of curse. The asphalt still had faint skid marks, curving in a way that showed the motorbike hadn't lost control. A straight line, then a sharp turn into the pedestrian lane. Too precise. I crouched down and traced the ground with my fingers. And there, half hidden by the dust and gravel, was a broken piece of black plastic, jagged and oily to the touch. Probably from a motorcycle fender. Not much, but enough. I put it in my pocket. Proof always starts from the little things. I walked around the area, asking around. Most witnesses recalled only the roar of the engine, the flickering headlights, and the screams. But a man selling roasted chestnuts on the corner pulled me back. His hands shook as he spoke. "They didn't just pass by," he muttered. "They waited. Parked there, maybe 15 minutes. Watched. Then they came straight for him, Jack, your friend. But she pushed him away. Took it herself." That detail made me ache. If that was true, then Tu Tien's sacrifice was more than just instinct. It was the difference between life and death for Jack. And that means Jack is the real target. Back in the office, I presented the evidence. The debris, the old man's testimony, the silence that had fallen over the hospital, and Jack's haunted face. Why would someone target him? I started digging. Records, business deals, old partnerships. Jack wasn't rich, but he was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. 2 years ago, he'd invested in a construction project with a man named Tran Hao. The deal fell through, leaving How nearly bankrupt, while Jack pulled out at the last minute, saving himself but leaving How deep in debt. How had a motive, and as far as I knew, How was not a forgiving person. He had connections who settled matters with fists and knives rather than contracts. The more I read, the more clearly I realized Jack's tragedy was not due to fate. It came from revenge. But there's a difference between suspicion and proof. If How was behind this, he'd be careful. People like him always are. They hide behind layers of fear, behind reckless people willing to do dirty work for a quick buck. I need more than that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Images kept flashing through my mind. The tire tracks, the salesman's trembling voice, Tu Tien's tearful silence. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the spicy taste soothing my thoughts. In 20 years, I have seen many men like Jack, normal, flawed, but not evil. And I have seen many women like Tu Tien, strong, willing to shoulder a burden beyond their strength. They deserve the truth, not the darkness. So I made a promise to myself. I would dig until I found the hands that were controlling the motorbike. Whether it was How or someone else, I would find them. Because pain without justice is a wound that never heals. And I have seen too many unhealed wounds in my life. The next morning, the city was still damp from the late-night drizzle. I returned to the crime scene, this time without sirens or uniforms crowding the air. Police tape still flapped in the early morning breeze, but the commotion had died down. This was my favorite time to look around, when the silence gave way to whispering walls. Tu Tien's apartment was tidy, but tidy in a way that made me uncomfortable. People who lived in real chaos often left traces of life scattered everywhere: an unwashed cup, a crumpled receipt, a jacket draped over a chair. Here, however, everything was arranged almost too perfectly, as if someone wanted it to look staged. My instincts, honed over 2 decades of watching lies dance in the shadows, told me that this was more than a random attack. I crouched near the window where the intruder was supposed to have entered. The lock had been broken from the inside, not the outside. That meant Tu Tien either knew the attacker, or someone had meticulously covered their tracks. I traced the window frame with a gloved finger. There was a faint, almost invisible stain. A patch of black dirt. City people never carried dirt with them unless they were going somewhere unusual. I carefully put it in my pocket. The first leaders. At the police station, I asked Detective Marquez, a younger officer assigned to assist me, to take a soil sample to the lab. Have them check for plant residue, fertilizer, or anything. Someone brought the soil into that room, and I want to know where it came from. While I waited, I reviewed the interviews from the night before. Jack, heartbroken, eyes swollen from crying, swearing he had no enemies. His words sounded true, but grief sometimes hides guilt. Neighbors claimed they saw a tall figure in a hooded jacket loitering near the entrance 2 days before the attack. They thought it was just someone waiting for you. Tu Tien's colleague, Mai Lin, said that recently Tu Tien has been worried and often whispers that someone is following him after work. That was the first clue I could find. If she had spoken of her fears, then she must have had reason to believe she was being followed. Magazine. Later, back at the apartment, I searched for anything: personal letters, notes, diaries. Victims often leave behind traces of their inner storms. In the drawer of her bedside table, beneath the neatly stacked notebooks, I found a small, leather-bound diary. The pages revealed more than the police report could. In hurried handwriting, Tu Tien wrote about a man she called Shadow. He waits on the corner, sometimes near the bus stop. I don't know if it's paranoia, but his presence weighs me down. Jack says I'm imagining it, but I know his gaze burns my back. Continued at the bottom of the page. 2 nights ago, a letter slipped through the door. There was no return address. Just 4 words. No escape. I sighed. This was no random act. Someone had planned this long before the attack. The secret of the land. By evening, the test results were back. The soil was determined to have come from a very special greenhouse on the outskirts of town. It contained pollen from rare orchids, grown by only a handful of nurseries. I drove there in the dark, headlights cutting through the mist. The greenhouse was quiet but not empty. A caretaker, old and tired, recognized the shape of a man in a hooded coat. He was here last week, the caretaker admitted nervously. Tall, broad-shouldered. Buys orchids, but not for show. Asks strange questions about how long orchids last without water and how to hide them. I asked the gatekeeper his name, but he said nothing. I had only a vague memory of the scar that ran across the man's right hand. Follow the trail. Back in town, I broadened my search. Scarred men with a passion for orchids were not uncommon. I checked local criminal records and found a name. Duc Van, a former gang member who had been dismantled years earlier. Duc had disappeared after serving a prison sentence for extortion and drifted into the underworld. I remember him. Cold eyes, unblinking stare, like a predator. If he was involved, this wasn't just an obsession, it was a job. Maybe someone paid him. That thought dragged me deeper into the underworld. Who would want Tu Tien to be harmed? She was not a criminal, not a politician, just a woman living quietly with Jack. Unless Jack himself had enemies, or Tu Tien had discovered something she was not supposed to know. The phone is broken. The final segment of the day was when the forensic team returned Tu Tien's broken phone. The screen was cracked, but the data was intact. Among her messages was an unsent draft sent to Jack. If anything happens to me, go to the person you trust least. Mysterious but purposeful. She suspected betrayal from someone close to her. Not a stranger, not a nameless shadow, but someone within reach. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. It was no longer about a nameless stalker in the shadows. It was about betrayal, manipulation, and a conspiracy that slowly closed in on the people she loved. And somewhere in the silence of the office, I knew Duc Van was just the blade. The hand holding it was still visible. End of day. As the clock struck midnight, I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. The fragments were scattered, but they began to form a picture. Tu Tien is afraid of a person she calls Shadow. The man with the scar, named Duc Van, matched the description and left dirt marks at the scene. He did not act alone. Someone directed him to Tu Tien. Her very words hinted at betrayal from someone close. The question still hangs like smoke in the air. Who will benefit from her suffering? I closed the diary and rubbed my temples. Tomorrow, I would continue following the orchid and scar trail. The predator was getting closer to its prey, and so was I. The difference is I've been patient for 20 years. And I know that the closer I get, the more dangerous the game becomes. The third day, the rain fell again, steady and relentless, turning the streets into mirrors reflecting neon lights and darkness. I was used to long nights of chasing ghosts, but this time, it felt personal in a way I could never forget. Tu Tien's words haunted me. Look at the person you trust the least. I repeated those words over and over again, like a key that wouldn't fit a certain lock. Who was she referring to? A visit to Jack. I returned to Jack's apartment. He looked worse than before, his eyes sunken, his hair disheveled, grief etched into every line of his face. But grief comes in many forms. Sometimes it's guilt in disguise. Jack. I began. Does Tu Tien have anyone in her life she doesn't trust? Someone she keeps at a distance. His eyes flashed with worry. She sometimes fights with my Lin, but they're friends. She doesn't mean it. Friends argue, yes. But has my Lin ever resented her? Jack rubbed his temples. You don't understand. Tu Tien is kind, too kind. Sometimes people take advantage of her, but she never blames them. She forgives too easily. That saying has stuck with me. Forgiveness can be a shield, but it can also be a blindfold. The interrogation. I brought my Lin in for questioning. She was polite and calm, but her eyes darted around too quickly when I asked. My Lin, I said. Tu Tien wrote in her diary about a man following her. Have you ever seen this man? She shook her head too quickly.
No.
She never told me that.
A lie.
I can smell it. Do you two work in the same office? Correct. And you know her relationship with Jack. Her lips pressed together. It was a hint of jealousy, unspoken, but loud enough for me to hear. Tell me, I leaned closer. Why was Duc Van, a man covered in scars and with a history of violence, at your workplace 2 weeks ago? Her face paled. I don't know who that person is. But her trembling hands betrayed her. A connection appears. That evening, I looked it up. The call log showed a string of calls between My Lin and an unregistered number. That number led to a disposable phone. And that disposable phone pinged near the greenhouse where Duc Van bought the orchids. The circle tightens. But anyway, I can't just accuse her right now. There needs to be a motive. There needs to be evidence. Orchid trap. I set a trap very carefully. With Marquez's help, we leaked false information that we had found new evidence on Tu Tien's phone, a recording that named her stalker. We offered to play the recording at a press conference. If My Lin gets involved, they will definitely panic. Panic makes people careless. Sure enough, less than 24 hours later, Duc Van reappeared, this time caught on security cameras near the station, watching. He was anxiously awaiting instructions, which meant the puppet master was pulling the strings again.
The chase.
We followed him through the rain-soaked streets. Duc was cautious, always checking his reflection in the window, but experience had taught me patience. Eventually, he led us to a quiet cafe, not a gang den or a warehouse. And there, in the corner, My Lin sat. She leaned across the table and whispered urgently to him. I couldn't hear what she said, but it didn't matter. Just seeing her was enough. When they parted, I followed My Lin. She walked quickly, holding an umbrella to cover her face, but her phone betrayed her again, texting Duc repeatedly, urging him to finish before the police find more. The mask has slipped off. The confrontation. I confronted her in the interrogation room. The evidence was spread out on the table. Phone logs, greenhouse soil, security footage. Finally, she broke down. Jealousy and bitterness poured out like poison. She had it all, My Lin whispered through tears. Jack's love, respect at work, friends who admired her. And me? Always the shadow, always second best. I thought if she left, maybe Jack would see me again. It's the oldest motive in the book. Jealousy. Not money, not power, just the desperate hunger to be seen. She hired Duc Van as a weapon, manipulating him with promises of money and protection. He was the shadow Tu Tien feared, but My Lin was the mind behind the darkness. The arrest. Thanks to her testimony, the case was quickly cleared. Duc Van was arrested 2 days later, found hiding in an abandoned warehouse. He did not resist. Men like him rarely do when their money is low. He admitted to breaking into the apartment, sending threatening letters, and stalking her from the shadows. But he was just the blade. My Lin was just the hand. Jack's silence. When I told Jack, his face fell in disbelief.
My Lin?
She's her best friend. Sometimes, I said softly, the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the most. He nodded slowly. 20 years in the business had taught me that people are more dangerous than the darkness. Darkness vanishes in the light. But jealousy? Jealousy lingers. And in the end, it was what killed Tu Tien, not only a man covered in knife scars, but also a friend who could never bear to live in her light.